Brendan, I thought with your leave, I don't usually do this. In fact, I've never done it and it may go horribly wrong, but I thought that I would do a pro radio move and hit the intro with you so that we can transition straight into your response to it. And if it goes horribly off the rails, then we can include this part as a disclaimer and I'll fix the rest later so that I sound like a genius, which I know you as a publicity expert know all about.
Sounds good.
All right, check it out. We'll hear the music. Welcome to Major Label Debut, the podcast about major label debuts. My name is Graham Wright, and in 2007, I, in my capacity as a member of the indie rock band Tokyo Police Club, arrived in Austin, Texas, America for my first ever South by Southwest. And the first thing we had to do was go to a restaurant where we were meeting someone to do an interview. And meeting us at the restaurant, we knew, was our first ever publicist. We had never had a publicist before. We weren't totally clear on what it meant, but we knew they facilitated interviews. When we got to the restaurant, a convertible pulled up, and a man stepped out of the convertible and knew, without asking, that all of us were 20 years old, not yet old enough to drink in America at South by Southwest, a drinking event as much as it is anything else. That man opened the trunk of his car, and in the trunk of the car were several loose cans of warm Tecate beer. And we all got to have a delicious trunk beer before we went into our interview. Little did we know, that was the beginning of a long, fruitful, and beautiful friendship and collaboration that continues to this day. The man who stepped out of that car, who was our first publicist, who was Tokyo Police Club's last publicist, and has publicized many of my doings and shenanigans in between. That man, Brendan Bourke, is my guest today. Brendan, do you remember that moment as vividly as I do?
I remember it very vividly, yes. So it was at a steakhouse in Austin. I will say that I don't actually remember the name of said steakhouse, but yeah, I've always prided myself on being a publicist that made certain that their artists were taken care of and felt comfortable and prepared for what lay before them in the wonderful world of having to do interviews with press.
And I, as a young person, was really not relaxed about a lot of things, and including interviews, which in retrospect is one of the more laid back tasks of the musician, is answering questions about yourself. It's kind of a unfuck-upable gig. And yet I would get really nervous about it. I remember doing my first ever phoners from my parents' house in Newmarket, Ontario, and sneaking some Crown Royal out of the liquor cabinet because I just was so amped up about doing the interview, which was, of course, 3.5 minutes long of rote questions from a student. So that Tecate was very appreciated. And I don't remember the restaurant either because my memory has shrunk to just that can, like, in motion on, you know, the fuzzy gray interior trunk carpeting. And you told me you always rented a convertible at South by Southwest. And I was like, this is a cool person.
That was a South by Southwest and Los Angeles rule. Always rent a convertible. But you are certainly not alone in having interview angst. I think that is fairly common for artists. Some of them carry that throughout their career. But certainly for artists who are just, you know, getting their first start and first crack at having to do interviews and talk about yourself and talk about your music. You know, it's most of the time when you're making an album, I don't think you necessarily think about having to talk or answer questions about it. You're just sort of writing and recording.
Yeah. And I found it, I think, you know, growing up in the 90s, so much of what bands were to me when I was dreaming of being in a band, they were almost as much as they were songs on the radio. They were interviews on Much Music or in magazines that I would buy or read on the burgeoning internet. So I think I really perceived the interview as being as important, perhaps, as the music itself. I'm not sure if that's wrong, although I do feel like maybe my priorities were not exactly in order.
And, you know, who's going to hear the music if you don't do the interviews?
Well put. And that is a perfect segue to back up slightly. We're all about pulling back the curtain here on Major Label Debut. We have not yet spoken to a publicist. We have not yet spoken to someone outside of the, like, in the studio making the record capacity, producers, bands. I guess we talked to Bob Mayer, a writer. But you are embedded in the industry in a way that we haven't really talked about on this show, even though everything we talk about on the show has to do with it. So I wondered if we could start by maybe giving the listeners a 101 description of just what it is a publicist does and maybe did, because I know a lot of that is in the process of shifting seismically.
Certainly. I mean, when all is said and done, the job of the publicist is to tell the story of the artist. If I could summarize it down to one sentence, the ultimate job is basically convincing writers, editors, TV bookers, NPR producers, podcast makers that the artist you are representing is worth speaking to and telling their story about the record itself. As you mentioned, that has obviously changed greatly over the 30 years now that I've been doing this, from early days of it just being band makes good record being a good enough story to band makes good record not being a story at all. So the storytelling portion, I say, has gotten more important than ever over the years as you try to find those nooks and crannies outside of the ever dwindling number of publications that write about music.
And I think that we'll definitely get into that, how it's changed and what that means for telling the story and what kind of stories people have been looking for and bands have been generating, etc. What were the stories like when you were first coming online as a music fan? Do you remember like the first bands you were falling in love with, and specifically the bands whose mystique and narrative and whole vibe beyond just the songs really connected with you?
Yeah, I mean, I think funny enough, when I first started reading music magazines and probably the early days of being a publicist, I mean, the most band interviews were literally just about the music and the album and what led them into the songwriting or the themes that represent this album. And not to say that isn't still part of the storyline. It's just that there were so many more music publications and they only cared about what went into making the current record that band was talking about and trying to sell. Mm-hmm. And of course, there'd be the crazy tour stories and, things that happen on the road. And, for better or worse, people probably were up to far more greater shenanigans 30 years ago than they are now because they knew that nobody was filming it on their phone.
Yes, and they could tell the story sort of edited after the fact for the audience. And also, you did maybe less editing back then, I've heard.
Well, I think there was certainly a degree more of softball pitching to, especially to any of the larger artists back in those days.
How did you get into it? What was your path from music lover to music industry insider, mover, shaker, mogul?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't really have any concept of the music industry at all. I just was a music fan, between 120 Minutes and buying copies of The Village Voice and Enemy weeks after they came out, but finally made it to print to a bookstore in Houston. So that was my whole concept of that world until I had the good fortune of going to college at NYU in New York City, back where I came from originally. And ended up just befriending a band from Boston at the time called Fuzzy, who I really liked. Fuzzy shared a drummer with the Lemonheads, Mr. Dave Ryan, who was a phenomenal drummer and a generally good human being, as the rest of the band were. And I just ended up spending a fair amount of time with them in various cities, New York included. And as 1 year of college was getting started, they played a show at CBGB's with another fantastic band from Boston called Papa's Fritas. And they introduced me to a gentleman named Mark Lipsitz, who was the GM at a label called Seed Records. And they were like, you should intern at Seed Records. And I was like, people do that? So Mark was like, hey, well, just come by the office next week. Here's the address. And the following, whatever it was, Monday or Tuesday, I went uptown to 60th Street between Madison and Fifth Avenue. To the, I can't remember the exact floor, I'll be honest. But met with Mark there and he's like, great, if you want to intern for us this semester, let's do it. And that was my beginnings.
Did that derail you from another path? Were you going to become a veterinarian or something?
No, I was the good old fashioned English literature major, which is a road to nowhere, really.
That was the road I was on too.
So yeah, and it works well thematically with this podcast in the sense that Seed Records was owned by Atlantic Records, which in the mid 90s, when the time we are speaking of, it was very popular for the major labels to have what we call their faux indie labels, yes, which was sort of like the farm teams for all of them. It was, when they signed a younger band who was just breaking out, it gave the younger band a chance to sort of soil their oats, if you will, in a musical sense, and build up a fan base and not have to be concerned about being on the giant major label. But it also was a place where they could put bands that they didn't want to be tainted by being on the major label as well.
Yeah.
And then to have a triple function for those artists who had some success on the major label, but were no longer having success, but were still contractually on the label, to get sent down to the minor leagues, back to the faux indie, or to the faux indie for a first time. So
it really is exactly like a farm team.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because the faux indie has been something that major labels sort of ebbed and flowed on. I think it's once again kind of a popular thing for majors to have their, a lot of them they purchased and then sometimes just use that label when they feel like, oh, we can slap that label that we bought or had shelved. Or
I remember in like 2009 when Tokyo was talking to a bunch of labels and we wound up signing to Mom and Pop. But I feel like there was a version of that was starting to spike again, because we would have all these meetings. They would start, someone would be like, oh my God, so we're going to have lunch with a guy from Atlantic today. And then you get to the lunch and you'd be like, that guy was saying a whole different name. He was talking about like Fueled by Ramen or something, like Stiff Records. They're bringing it back. It's an IP that they bought at some point and they want to sign us to that.
Exactly.
We're like, so was that Atlantic? I still don't understand.
Yeah. Well, Fueled by Ramen, I think, is owned by Elektra these days, which is owned by Atlantic, which is owned by...
Yes. And it was an Elektra meeting we took. That was it. It was with Jeff Janik, the Fueled by Ramen guy, was kickstarting Elektra. This is real inside baseball shit for the heads.
Absolutely.
The target market of that part of the conversation was Josh and Paul, who are listening to us talk while they produce. So what were you doing at Seed Records day to day as an intern back then?
Well, ironically, at Seed Records, there was actually no in-house publicist.
Aha, lucky for you.
The nice thing about Seed Records is that it shared an office with another faux indie called Big Beat Records, but it was separate from the Atlantic office. So we had a floor on East 60th Street, and it had very much the feel and vibe of indie labels.
Could you paint a little picture? Because just I personally, as like, this is the era that defined what I wanted a label to be, but I think by the time we started visiting labels, they'd already gotten a little more professionalized or a little more amateurized, and there was less offices like this. So please, can you just situate me there for my own
New York Midtown office in sense, but we had the whole floor, and if you made a right out of the elevator, that was the Seed Records section. If you made a left, you were in the Big Beat section, and there was a receptionist sitting in the middle, taking orders for Chinese food and directing phone calls that came in. So, but it looked fairly fresh and clean. It wasn't like cramped, or it wasn't like the Matador Records office in the mid-90s, which looked like a hoarder's nightmare.
That hoarder's nightmare is so... I feel like that's what I'm romanticizing, because now there's no stuff. There used to be demos and publications and like physical stock, and everything that you did. A record contract was a piece of paper that existed. A record was a box of tape that existed. Now all you need to run a record label is all you need to make a podcast, is all you need to make a record or trade stocks or watch porn or read the news or anything, is the computer that we're both on. And so a record label office looks exactly the same as a tech startup, give or take.
It's more Scandinavian minimalists now.
Yeah. Yeah, they all have those phone booths that you just go sit in to do calls.
Exactly. But yeah, I wouldn't say like, this kind of looked like a 90s office, nothing like crazy. Obviously there were gold records and tour posters and photos of bands all over the place. So, it felt like a record label in that sense. Mm-hmm. But Seed was, I think there was 4 of us, or like 4 full-time people and myself as one of the interns. So I was doing mostly like calling college radio stations. And the favorite thing to do was calling all of the indie record stores. That was a weekly task. You'd call them up, whatever, the cool indie store in Indianapolis was, and you'd be like, hey, I'm just calling from Seed Records, wanted to see if you had copies of the Madder Rose album in stock, the Ivy album in stock, the Fuzzy album in stock. And they would go through and be like, yep, we've got 4 of those, 8 of the other. And then they're like, oh, we're out of this one. They're like, oh, well, we should have you reorder some stock into that was a weekly chore.
How many independent record stores were there at that point that were on your call list?
There was definitely hundreds. I mean, we're probably somewhere in the 500 to 1,000 range. So.
Oh, and you must have talked to some real characters too.
Oh, absolutely.
That's beautiful.
Some of them had no time for you. Some of them wanted to talk too much.
Oh, God. Yeah. So how quickly did you sort of zero in on Publicity as the stream?
Well, I very quickly at Seed had an important music industry life lesson, which was that between the fall semester and spring semester, when I came back, the entire staff had been fired, and a new staff had been brought in under a new name. So the label was now called Tag Records, which stood for the Atlantic Group.
Aha.
So I had a whole new group of coworkers at Tag Recordings, and which included a publicist. So for the first time, there was a publicist in the office to actually, and I just kind of got funneled into the publicity department. Ironically, that publicist had never been a publicist before, and that publicist ended up being my co-business partner for Tag Team. So.
You said Tag, and I was like, oh my God, this is like when you watch a prequel to a movie and they start dropping bits and pieces of the original plot. You're like, I know Tag Team.
That was part of the nod and the wink to Tag Team Media, was the origins of the name.
What do you think it was about you at the time, and I imagine still, that made you a good fit for that? You know, what are the character attributes that define a successful publicist?
I mean, you have to be relentless to a certain degree, patient to the other degree, and then be able to take a whole whopping amount of rejection. So the overwhelming part of being a publicist is getting passes, getting ignored. You know, you're constantly having to circle back to your pitches. And as I always say, being patiently persistent, which is not annoying the shit out of people by calling them constantly and saying, hey, did you listen to this? But also, you know, not forgetting that you have a job to do at the same time. So, and then obviously my English literature degree got put to good use by constantly having to write press releases.
That's what I wanted to ask about next, in fact, was the press release, and maybe more broadly, the notion of like a band story that you were talking about. Do you remember like the first campaign where you were aware of the story as an element of it? I don't know if that's because the band had such an undeniable story, or if you found yourself helping them find the story, or like, when was the first time you went, aha, that's the ticket?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a lot more. I didn't really get into having to shape the story more until I had moved on to my first indie PR company, which was a company called Girly Action, who's still around. But, you know, I think when I was at record labels themselves, at Tag Recordings, or eventually at Beggar's Banquet, where I went next, there was like the bio and all of that came from the UK, or it came from somebody. And it was like, this is the story. This is what you want to focus on.
Right.
Here's the bio, which is still, you know, current today. Like, you know, the bio is going to shape everything, and a good bio can make or break you. But, you know, find the elements of the bio that you feel are going to connect with whomever you're calling to. So, and, you know, certainly back in those days, all the pitching was done by calling. So a lot of times you had 30 seconds or less to, you know, get your elevator pitch out there, or often just on voicemail.
Yeah.
So, you know, if you're calling Rolling Stone, it's a different angle than if you're calling the New York Times or the Peoria Independent or Alternative Press. You're like, who am I talking to? What are they interested in? And what part of this band's story do you think is going to intrigue them enough to actually play the music while they're doing something else?
And obviously back then there were way more publications, I mean, about music in general than they are now, and also specifically about indie bands. Because at Rolling Stone, you're competing with Springsteen and Dylan and Oasis and literally everyone who makes music. And so you're a small fish in a big pond if you're working for an indie. But there was a whole world of indie music media.
There was fanzines, which morphed into blogs. I had a fanzine in the mid-90s as well.
What was it? Tell us about it.
It was called Hello Sailor. And it was, you know, mostly an indie music magazine, but it also, anything pop culture or anything that intrigued any of the writers who want to write about, they went in there. We only had a few issues before our art designer had a nervous breakdown and disappeared, and took that almost finished issue with her. And it just sort of took the air out of the balloon. Everyone was like, okay, we did that. Let's move on to something else.
Do you have a copy of all the issues you did produce in a box somewhere?
I do have the first 2 issues on me in my apartment, and they are in the library at some university in the Midwest of the US that I can't remember.
Oh, wow. Still legacy.
Indeed.
I guess I want to get a sense of like the standard shape? Because you said, okay, the label sends you the bio. So the whole stream of going from like band forms, band writes songs, band gets signed, band makes record, band delivers record, label writes bio, facilitates photo shoots. And now we're getting into the world where publicity is part of it. Where do you tend to come in that phase,
I think it really depends project by project, to be honest, and the relationship that you have with the artist. There's a difference of just starting to work with an artist versus an artist that you've had a long relationship where you feel like you can just interject yourself into the conversation of what's going on. I think once you're at an independent PR firm, usually, and especially if you're dealing with an indie label, because there's less of a staff behind it, there's a conversation as to like, hey, what do you think of this storyline? Or what do you think of this angle, or what do you think of these photos? We took 1,000 photos. Which 5 do you think are the best ones to go? That's all part of the conversation. Do we have the one girl in the band up front, or do we have her mixed in with the guy so it doesn't look like it's her fronting a backing band? So all of those conversations happen.
Would you be like in rooms with contact sheets and, looking
Certainly back in the day. I'm sure I have in my file. I have way too many old files still I've got a whole storage space filled with press clippings and photos and old demos and stuff of that nature, because I can't seem to get rid of it.
When we open the MLD museum, we will acquire your collection.
That's good to know. So I haven't quite gotten around to I bought a shredder, but I haven't actually started shredding.
You got to save that for a special day. Shredding a bunch of documents is one of the most fun you can have with your clothes on. That's what they say. You can do it nude. It's just not advised.
I think, again, if you're dealing with a smaller independent label and you might be dealing with one person at the label, the manager and the band, all of that directly. So there's much more hands-on sculpting that goes on. But, I think to go in the simplest terms, one of the main things I tell any artist before they do an interview, and this sort of goes into shaping the whole album campaign, is like, what are the 3 things you want people to walk away from this interview with? And then think about those things. And then when you do an interview and you get nervous or you think the question's stupid, just go back to one of those 3 things.
Talking points.
Indeed. So as I always say, interviewers just want content from you. They don't care if you necessarily answered your question or not. As long as you said something interesting, then great. They can use that, edit that, and turn it into a good story.
I remember reading an interview with Tom Waits, and he would just say things. He would talk about like facts about honeybees or something. And it was completely unrelated. And I would feel so obligated as a nervous interviewee to make sure not only did I answer their question, but I answered it like fulsomely, intelligently, and like succinctly. It felt like I was doing a job interview every time.
Certainly. How did you come up with that band name?
I wish I remembered all the old lies we used to tell when we were too embarrassed to say we got it off an internet name.
I mean, you have to at some point, because it's just the world's worst question, especially when it's not your debut single,
yeah. I mean, you're just telling people what your influences are and how you formed for your entire career.
The amount of interviews that I've seen go off the rail by a poorly landed, not very well thought out question.
Well, because I remember reading a lot of interviews, like I was saying, online. Before I was in a band, I was a huge music fan, and that the internet was new, and you could go read like, oh my God, here's a Sigur Rós fan site that has every Sigur Rós interview. And a lot of those interviews in particular, the transcript would end with like the publicist chiming in and saying, that's our time. And then it'd be like, Jonsi hangs up, mid-sentence.
You're supposed to edit that out.
Because I don't seem to recall you being on the phone for many of the interviews I did that you facilitated, but are there particular artists, and feel free to anonymize?
Elliott Smith, I was on every phone interview that he did. He was a nervous interviewer, didn't like doing them, and he felt better knowing that myself or one of his publicists was there listening in and could interject or end things as what happened to Jonsi's interview as well.
Well, so with Elliott, I really I can see exactly why he might need that, because there's the way that people now, at least, and in my era as an Elliott Smith fan, engage with his music and with him is like pretty hungrily, I might say. There's a lot, people really want to go straight to the point of like his mental health and his issues, and like they want to get to some perceived truth of how like the the core of Elliott Smith is romantically fractured, and that's why the music and blah, blah, blah. Was it like that at the time? Like, did you have to protect him to some degree from that overbearing, rabid?
Definitely. I mean, obviously has gotten time as obviously romanticizes things to a degree, but he was very wary of how press perceived him and didn't always, feel that was accurate. So he was wary about going into interviews from the get-go. So it was always just, kind of getting him through the experience. I was joked, I had no artist that I just had a Microsoft Word doc because that was the time it was. And I just had this very long list of interview requests, and people would call me and say, hey, we really would love to interview Elliott for this. I'm like, great. I'm like, I'll add you to the list. And I didn't say where on the list they were being added. It could have been 101 or it could have been number 3. But it was an extremely lengthy list of interviewers that almost none of which actually got their interview set up.
It must have been nice for a change to have people pursuing you.
Oh, that's certainly nice until they start to get angry about the fact that you haven't scheduled their.
Well, you must really be the front line because there is, and even now with less and less music publications, there's a real entitlement that you see from people to like, well, you're making a record. You want people to listen to the record. So you should drop everything and talk to me for my, my blog that has 3 readers and give me an hour of your time or whatever it is, not to be too cynical about all this. A lot of people are great, but and you're the person who's fielding those requests first.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of times where you just have to be, always being polite, of course, but sometimes you have to be the polite asshole.
Yes.
All right. I fully understand that you want to even, guest list requests. I'm like, sometimes the band's got 10 spots on their guest list and 15 people interested in going. And, the reality is you're going to have to pick the people that the band's going to get the most mileage out of their attendance. And that's just the sad nature of the way it goes. But you definitely have to break a number of hearts along the way.
What's the hottest ticket guest list show you can remember fielding requests for?
I mean, it's wild because guest lists now are just not anywhere close to what they used to be number-wise. I mean, I remember Broken Social Scene shows where we had close to 100 people on the guest list, and it's like insane because, the label had to buy all of those tickets.
Right.
And the label was an independent label, so they were, spending $3,000 on concert tickets for this. So I do remember a journalist who I won't mention, obviously, getting angry that they couldn't get a +1 to the show. And so they didn't bother showing up. And they were the one person of, let's say, 90 people who didn't bother showing up to the show that night. So yes, the next morning they got a very irate message from me about how they were never going to be invited back to another show after that fact.
Have you ever become, I also have to be careful because if I was like, hey, Brendan, why isn't Tokyo Police Club on this new list in such and such publication? You don't want to be like, oh, it's because I'm in a feud with the editor over a guest list slate from 7 years ago.
I have a few long feuds. I have one feud, a journalist who I have a feud with, but it's gotten so long that I can't remember what we were feuding about in the first place.
Hatfields and McCoys.
Indeed. It is a fine balance, though, obviously. I can't, I then have to turn around and to my baby band that hasn't gotten any press yet, then have to turn around and pitch the same person about hey, can you write about this band nobody's heard of yet?
Not naming any names, but I remember one particular occasion where someone that I had crossed paths with, let's say, responded in their capacity as a music industry professional to someone who was, writing in their capacity as a critic. And it was like early Twitter days when I think maybe people hadn't quite caught on to the fact that it's like everyone can see this and it lives there forever. But I remember even then recoiling in horror at that's just not done, I thought, to respond to critics. But have you ever had to tame bands who want to call out someone that gave their record a bad review?
Yeah, I mean, nothing no crazy stories that I can remember. It's usually when something is just factually incorrect. Right. I mean, you can't control somebody not liking your record. And, I feel like there's in the days of the most things being online and then therefore editable, the people be like, can you get them to say this? And I'm like, well, not really. I mean, they're reviewing it. It's their opinion. Just because you don't like it, it doesn't mean that it's wrong or incorrect. But, if there's any just factually incorrect stuff, especially, now you can kind of Google most things, but certainly 20 years ago when, somebody might have just had a incorrect idea of where this person came from or what they, their prior life as Grand Duke of so you're like, where did this come from? So, that happened. But what are you going to do? Write a correction, which sometimes was done, but who goes into the newspaper and reads the correction section?
Yeah. So. In the early days of Tokyo Police Club, Dave edited our Wikipedia so that in the top, the first blurb you see, it said that Pitchfork had called Tokyo Police Club like the greatest, and then it was 9 words of sort of fake genre word salad, post proto new wave punk blah blah blah, since the reissue of Pavement's Wowie Zowie, which had happened like literally that year. Like just a really silly joke that we thought was just would get caught and edited by the Wikipedia cowboys. And instead, for like 2 or 3 years, constantly, like people would ask very straight-facedly, like, how did it feel? It must have been such an honor. And then they would read the quote out through their mouth and somehow not in that process catch on to the fact that it was a joke. So,
there's no lies on the internet.
Well, it's now more than ever. So getting back to the chronological run through, Tag Team. It says here 2001 it started. I hope that, speaking of there being no lies on the internet.
That is actually correct.
There's also no lies on this piece of paper I have. What was the impetus to put out your shingle, so to speak?
I mean, crazy times. I had 3 wonderful years working for the lovely ladies who own Girly Action Media, but I was sort of, in the world of PR more so than now, but not necessarily true. But there's sort of like the senior publicist and the junior publicist, or the national publicist or the junior publicist. But I had spent sort of the 3 years of Girly Action heading up the junior PR section of the team, and kind of there was just a ceiling where none of the national publicists were going anywhere. So I couldn't go anywhere. And then my friend Julie, who I had met at Tag Recordings, she came over from another PR firm, Nasty Little Man, didn't just gel with, it was a wildly different group of people and vibes from Nasty Little Man to Girly Action. And she just didn't gel there herself. So she was trying to convince me to start our own company together, which I thought was crazy. Julie at Nasty Little Man was required to bring in her own projects, so she was always out fishing for new stuff. As the junior publicist to Girly Action, that was not part of my job. So I think I had brought in 1 or 2 projects in the 3 years that I was there. So it felt rather daunting to start your own company that relied on money for artists you were going to bring in when you had not ever had the experience of going out and bringing in projects. So. But I know that I had gotten in my year review at the time and was once again not getting promoted. And so I just was like, well, fuck it. Let's explore this option. And then I had a very fortuitous phone call from Daniel Kessler, which listeners would know as the guitarist for Interpol. But once upon a time, Daniel was an NYU student who interned for me when I was working at Beggar's Banquet. So I knew Daniel from that. He called me up on my office phone at Girly Action. It's like, hey, I'm helping Domino Records launch a U.S. office, and I'd love to talk to you about doing PR for the first release we're going to put out, which was Clinic, one of my already a favorite band of mine. So I said, hold on, Daniel, let me call you right back. At which point I took the elevator downstairs, or more likely I went down the 13 floors in the stairwell, as I usually did, pulled out my flip phone and called Daniel back and was said, well, funny you should bring this up because I'm talking about starting my own company with a coworker, friend of mine. And we sort of went from there. Great big leap. I think we took a whole 2 projects from Girly Action with us, which were Tegan and Sarah and the excellent electronic duo on Warp Records, Plaid.
Yeah.
And otherwise, just a giant leap of faith, really.
Did you have an office to start off with?
We did, of course, because we were professionals. So when we got ushered out the door at Girly Action earlier than we gave our 2 weeks notice and were told to leave immediately, we were able to walk all of our stuff over to our new office, which was a whole 3 blocks away, including my life-size cardboard cutout of Jarvis Cocker from Pulp.
Is that still floating around somewhere?
Sadly, I mean, it was very different class era. So his like had this arm with a dangling hand out to the side. And after years of abuse, the arm and hand started to fall off. And
Jarvis Cocker's standee has a lot of spindly parts. It's not the strongest shape.
It's not meant for decades.
What do you remember when you think about those early days of tag team?
It felt definitely pretty wild. I mean, we had a lot of great projects very quickly. We signed on to work Death Cab for Cutie. We had Tegan and Sarah going. I mean, I remember flying out to LA to convince Tegan and Sarah's label that they should leave Girly Action and come with me, which felt crazy at the time. I did think it was it might have been my first ever work trip out to LA.
Did you rent a convertible?
I did, yes.
Hell yeah. You knew.
Got to stick with that rule. But yeah, it felt like, I was 20, just before my 27th birthday is when we started tag team. So it felt like I was doing something completely, half great and half the worst decision of my entire life. And then, it felt like things were just getting rolling right when September 11th happened. And a bunch of labels were like, we're going to put a pause on what's on these releases and see how the dust settles. Caused a bit of a hiccup in terms of billing and trying to make a living, but a brief bubble.
It's really fascinating to me, Brendan, how much, I suspect to anyone who was there at the time, this is maybe a silly thing to be surprised by, but, I always knew September 11th as a major thing that happened on the news. I was in high school, we were in Canada, it was the story, it was a big deal, but it was such a big deal that it's sometimes hard for me to remember now that it also happened to everyone who was in New York, and a lot of people were in New York, and a lot of the music industry, especially at that moment, which is such an exciting moment in the music industry, that was all in New York too. And we'd start Tokyo, would go to New York all the time and meet all these people we worked with, and they would all have 9/11 stories. And it's so interesting to me how it really affected the music industry. People were putting releases on pause. It changed the trajectory in some way of everyone's careers and journeys.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure it felt cinematic for most people who watched it on TV. I know I watched the entire thing from the roof of my building.
Yeah.
On 24th in Lexington. And then I didn't know what to do. So I packed up my bag. My dog and I walked down to the office because that seemed like the only logical thing to do. So I was walking downtown with the dog while all these people were walking uptown covered in soot. And it was very surreal. But I had a client arriving in town that morning of September 11th, which was the band Clinic. And they were about to kick off their tour. So we were supposed to do promo on September 11th and September 12th. There was no phones at the office, so there was literally nothing I could do once I got to the office. And I don't quite remember how, but I did end up finding and meeting up with the Clinic guys that night at a bar, Pharmacy, which you might recall on 14th Street between Avenue A and B.
Oh, yeah.
You had to have a proof that you lived below 14th, across 14th that night. Happened to have some mail from the office in my bag, so that was my ticket to get below 14th Street. But I still to this day have zero idea of how we managed to actually meet up. But the next day, September 12th, we did our full day of promo. We didn't do any photo shoots outside because Clinic, were dressed in surgeons' masks and gowns, and it seems not tasteful. But we did the entire press day otherwise, which also seems completely bonkers. It's like, oh, that event happened. Let's continue to do press.
Yep. Let's just do a junket and sort of surreally go through all these conversations about process and artistry and how the band formed and our influences.
Exactly.
And yet, this is not a 9/11 podcast, but for me, it's so tied into Tokyo Police Club was born out of this love we all had for indie rock at this moment when indie rock, as we now understand it, was sort of, if not being born, was exploding in this new way into a different part of the mainstream. And that was really centered in a big way on New York. And, there was social scene and there was a Toronto thing and a Montreal thing, but the center of it, the sun at the center of the solar system for us certainly was the Strokes and Yeah and Interpol and all these New York bands. This is kind of goes without saying. And to me, this all was happening in like 2001, 2, 3, 4. And here is this, to put it mildly, seismic event that happens literally in the middle of it. When we were in New York for the last Tokyo show, I walked down to Ground Zero from the venue and was just sort of astounded by, I just walked past every part of New York City I ever spent any time in. And like,
Right.
we used to play at pianos and we used to hang out down like on Delancey and everything. And that's right there in the shadow of it.
Well, I think many ways, obviously, September 11th sort of shaped those next couple of years. And there was a much more like sense of like living your life to its fullest that came out of the, never know what day could be your last.
Yeah, because it was such a party scene.
Definitely.
Man, what was it like to be there? This is like getting to interview someone who was like in Harlem when jazz was exploding, or in Hamburg when the Beatles were playing. Like, you were fucking there, man. What was it like?
Funny, just in the sense that, since I was in my older late 20s at the time, I was like, I knew, I went to Plant Bar and went to, all the places where everyone was hanging out. But I felt like there were so many other things going on that I knew what was going on. And I saw all those bands in their earliest formations and shows, but it also just felt like, because we lived here, it didn't feel like that important. It was like, I'll see them another time somewhere else.
Yeah.
All good. I can go see this band from the UK or that band from out in LA. So it's almost like why go see your local bands when there's other cool bands coming through town that you want to see instead?
Is there any particular show that you passed on going to that you kick yourself for now? Or that other people think you ought to be kicking yourself for?
Oh, there probably is. I mean, I can mention a show that for one of the bands you just mentioned, who I walked out of their show like halfway through.
Was it just bad?
It was at the Mercury Lounge. I got there and I didn't quite realize that the buzz had gotten to where it was. And I was like, holy shit, it's like every A&R person from every major label is in this room right now. I'm like, what the fuck is going on? And then about 3 or 4 songs into that, I'm like, I've seen enough. Too buzzy for me.
Too buzzy. I think I understand that more now than I did when I was, even 27, 28, and certainly when I was 20
right
in New York for the first time. Did you feel that as that, because you had been immersed in indie rock from, globally long before this, this moment that I just described as the birth of indie rock, which it truly and literally was not. But did you notice a rising tide boat lifting situation with the acts you were working with, even if they weren't like hypey new New York bands?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I had the pleasure of first being friends with and then working with the Death Cab for Cutie guys. And I can't think of a band that sort of exemplified the rising boat sense, as they took the production and the songwriting to next levels with each album. It just, crescendoed with all the other indie bands that were sort of rising up, obviously leading into things like the OC and the big 6 Feet Under scene, on mushrooms in the back of the Hearst. And, I think the craziest moment for that definitely was with Death Cab, in LA at the Fonda Theater. And, I had Adam Brody from the OC was coming out early to interview the band for 17 magazine. And so Adam's publicist gave me his phone number and said, Adam's going to call you when he's outside the venue. And I went to let him in. He did the interview. And then the rest of the cast, all the teenagers, were all on the guest list. So just making sure that everyone got in. I was like, all right, well, this feels like a bonkers as shit moment.
Yeah. Well, it's so funny how like the intersection of like band world with acting worlds, everyone is so starstruck by each other, because acting world people are like actually famous. Adam Brody and Ben McKenzie and Misha at the time were like quite a lot more well-known than Ben Gibbard and Chris and the gang. And yet they were probably just as stoked to be coming to this show. And they were probably very grateful. I hope they were grateful and appreciative to you.
They were all very lovely, yes.
Damn straight. You heard it here first on Major Label Debut. Celebs, they're just like us.
I still have Adam Brody's phone number in my phone if we need to get him to chime in at any point.
If Lauren Conrad from The Hills still uses her BlackBerry email address, I have it memorized from when she came to one of our shows. And we didn't get to meet her, but she was there, they told us, or at least she was on the guest list.
So yeah, I mean, I think between Death Cab and then, as far as my own working experiences, just that explosion of Feist when I was working with her from Sesame Street to Apple commercials, which obviously led to the Sesame Street to hosting or to performing on Saturday Night Live. So.
Was that my perception of that, which I watched all that very interestedly, both as like a new music industry insider, but also a longtime Feist fan. Was it just the iPod commercial? Like, obviously the record's great, the song's great, but it looked to me like, here's the second Feist record. It's cool. People like it. Oh shit, it's the biggest thing in America.
Right. I mean, yeah, there was a lot of steps, obviously, that led to that. And, since this is major label debut, I think probably my favorite major label story as far as my work experiences was just that, Feist was obviously a member of Broken Social Scene. So I had met her briefly, vaguely through that. But her album, Let It Die, had come out in Canada and come out in Europe, but it was not out in the US. And it was the property of Interscope in the US. So I figured out who at Interscope was technically in charge of the record and found out that he was going to be in town for a sort of like semi-secret small show by that UK band Keane.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm like, all right, I'm going to go to this show. I'm going to speak with him and I'm going to figure out what's going on with the Feist record in the US. So I met him, brought it up. He was like, I have no idea who you're talking about or what this album is. So I was like, okay, so this is going to be a challenge. So I was like, all right, well, somehow we need to put this on Interscope's radar. So I ended up pitching a story on Feist to the Fader magazine back when it was a print publication, and they loved it. They did a big 8-page spread on Feist in it. I was like, this is beautiful. It came out. I made sure they shipped copies to the gentleman at Interscope and was like, here we are. The artist is ready to go. Crickets. Nothing. So I actually went to Montreal to meet up with Feist, who was on tour in Canada. Before setting up that Fader interview, I never had a conversation with her about her wanting to be her publicist. I just did it on my own volition. So I went up to actually have a conversation with her in Montreal to sort of strategize. They're like, yeah, let's keep moving forward. So I did another round of outreach and we got a feature story in Vogue, which I think is still the only feature story on a music artist I've ever gotten in Vogue, and Entertainment Weekly. And then before those came out, I just sent a note to the Interscope folks. And like, this is all running March, April. And they're like, oh, yep, album's coming out. So went straight into full on gear. I know it was too late to get Feist as a artist at South by, but let's just get her some day parties there.
Yep.
She got booked some West Coast dates with Kings of Convenience, who she was friends with. And then I asked one of my clients at the time, hey, you've got dates going from South by East to New York. Would you mind taking out this artist as your opening act? And they were like, yeah, love it. Let's do it. She did that whole clean sweep. And by the time we got to New York, things were blowing up next level. But it was very funny, just the obliviousness. I'm not that Interscope doesn't have 5,000 artists, but they obviously had just the lack of understanding that they had this record. They had this artist, and we're just like, I don't know. We've got another 100 artists that we're thinking about. So
yeah, this is just, you were talking about your Microsoft Word list earlier, and they're like, this is like number 103 on our Microsoft Word list.
And the best part is like when I was trying to get our contract together finally as the independent publicist, they're like, just reach out to the head of publicity at Interscope and sort out your contract. I'm like, great. Like, this is his name. This is his email. So I sent him an email. I'm like, hey, we're going to be working the Feist record. Just need to sort out a contract with you. No response. Checked in again. No response. Checked in again. No response. And then finally I got a response from their assistant whose email I did not have, but all it said was, what do you want? I was like, as you can see from my email below, we're working this album for you guys. I need to sort out a contract.
My ambition in life is now to have an assistant, and their sole task is to email anyone who emails me, what do you want?
Very, very straightforward.
Well, that's maybe a perfect example, because I want to ask about, your experience of the changing music industry landscape, shall we say. And that seems like a really good example where 10 years before that, you might have got on the phone like you were talking about. You had to call all of these record stores and you would talk to these people. And in a sense, it's easier to ignore a phone call because you don't pick up the phone, but it keeps ringing and it's usually just easier to pick the damn thing up
and get it over with.
Is it harder to get a hold of people and get work done now that everything happens on email than it was when everything happened on the phone, even though the phone seems like such a more cumbersome way to do it?
Oh, 1000%. I mean, it was so much easier to, like you said, most people, because they also didn't know who was calling them at the time.
That's true. It might be Trent Reznor. We got to pick it up.
It could be Trent Reznor. So you picked up the fucking phone just in case. And, usually the nice thing is you usually got a quick answer from people like, no, not interested in this. Or my one favorite from the editor of Alternative Press at the time who said, I'd rather shit a brick than fight about this man. So I put that in the report. The label really wanted Alternative Press for the band. I'm like, not happening. Editor really does not like the band. Yeah, and then the nice part, so many of my good friends are mostly former music journalists because we talked on the phone every week.
Yeah.
So it's simply much harder to build any relationship over email until you have that face-to-face opportunity. But I said, I think part of it is just that there's way more shows now than there ever used to be. And part is I don't think that young people go out to as many shows, but maybe I'm making that up because I'm not a young person, or they're desperately trying to ignore me. But I do think there's a bit more of a combative relationship between journalists and publicists these days, or an imagined one. Back in the day, it seemed more like we were all in it together. Like, your job sucks, my job sucks, but we have music in common. Let's go out and grab a drink.
Yeah, we're both in these low-paying, shitty jobs because we love music and we want to celebrate it or at least immerse ourselves in it. And so we have that in common, which is, yeah, I know that feeling too. And I feel like it was maybe already less common when I came into the industry than it had been. But that sense of just like, we're all in this together, from the label guy, the agent, the publicist, the whole team, so to speak. Maybe not always the lawyer, but even the lawyer got into it at some point because they love music. They just seem to have so much more money in such nicer offices. It was hard to get a hold of the lawyer.
I mean, I know some indie lawyers who are still in it to win it.
Hell yeah. No disrespect to the lawyers out there. Major Label Debut supports you. What do you call 10 lawyers driving off a cliff in a car? A bad thing to happen. That's how we tell the joke here at MLD. We love our lawyers. Please sponsor us. Any ambulance chasers, blood-sucking parasites, we are open.
I do love to sponsor things. So yeah, let's get that going.
That's the key. Yeah, just like really cheap local ads on a podcast never fails. As things have shifted, it seems clear to me that the big difference between 30 years ago, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, and now is simply that there's way less publications that write about music. Is that fair to say?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's a dying media landscape, certainly.
And many of the ones that exist seem like, almost, I remember you used to make a joke. We would always talk in Tokyo about like, who's going to premiere the song? There was a period of time when if you get a premiere on Pitchfork, it's going to get so many eyes on it. And if it's a cool band, Pitchfork might do it because it'll be the only place. But it became such like a game. I remember you joking about starting a website called like musicpremiers.com.
Yes. I still lament that I never launched musicpremiers.com. The tagline being, don't worry, we'll premiere it.
That would be my homepage. Maybe it's not too late. I mean, it must bug you even more than it bugs me as a musician, because I'm sure you hear people griping about this stuff all the time, like it's your fault. I remember we just did a big publicity campaign together for the death of Tokyo Police Club and the final tour and the final 2 songs. We released like a final single, which we really thought, once again, it was like one last getting our hopes up for Tokyo Police Club. We really thought that like this song's so good and it's our last single, people are going to go gaga for it. And then you'd get your weekly press updates back. And some of the stuff that you would get included in was hilarious. And it'd be like, this website's like top 50 songs of the afternoon. Not of the week, not even of the day, just of like in the last few hours since you came to our website, here's 50 more songs I got emailed by a publicist. So the bio becomes more important than ever because people are just copy and pasting it.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, your bio, your press release are going to get carbon copied. Plus side of which is that you can basically tell people what you want them to say.
You have a lot of control over what the story is for all the eyes that will behold it. What's obviously the hard part is getting anyone to give a shit. But like, what are what's the strategy for standing out amongst all that noise and for getting the publications to care in a way that's more than just like, sure, we'll add that to our like content swill shoot?
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, your best thing is to have some, what are our 5 to 10 big targets and how are we going to find a reason for them to write about that? And that's not easy. Like some of those storylines, you can't fake them. They're like, sometimes a band has a good storyline. A lot of the times they don't. It's like not everybody has some wild story where they were twins separated at birth and then met in college and formed a band together. It's like, great, but you couldn't have planned that. But it's literally, I feel half the time as we're trying to figure out what else do you like to do other than music?
Yeah.
Are you into fishing? Are you into sculpting? Like, what are the things we can pitch you to that are outside the music realm?
Right.
I mean, the sad reality is just that most music fans don't necessarily know how to find new music.
Yeah.
They don't know where to go anymore. Or they just, they get stuck in their whatever algorithm that Apple Music or Spotify or whomever it is has put them in, and nothing goes beyond that. What's
your position on lying for publicity, assuming that it's a harmless lie? Or who is that band that did like a fake sex tape leak? Do you remember that?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, in the sense that was brilliant, but it had a lot of backlash that came with it. So yeah, be careful what you lie about would be my most advice. And I think it's so hard to, unless you're the president of the United States, it's really hard to get away with lying these days.
I feel like bands and artists in general have never been more forthright and earnest. And a lot of the conversation about music seems to be very biographical now.
Sure.
And unless I'm really getting hoodwinked, I don't see a lot of fabrication or fabulism.
No.
Even Jack White's barely lying anymore. And that guy was the king for a while.
I mean, but now it's more about mental health than, dealing with your daily stresses and good old fashioned clean living.
I wonder about this because I see, when music comes out, often it will be accompanied, the big records will be accompanied by feature pieces that, we were talking about, like, what story do you want to tell? What is the hook? The hook all the time seems to be like, here's how this person was or is miserable and suffering and dealing with it, which I guess has always been, we talked about Elliott Smith and that was part of that story
I think
too.
More, it used to be like, this is how this person is suffering and continues to suffer in their music. And now it's more like, this is how they were suffering and how they've gotten better.
They've always got it figured out. And then you'll 4 records in, you're like, that's a lot of epiphanies for one person to have. But I genuinely think like if you're coming up, if you're 16 and you're in love with music and you're trying to become a musician, the stories that you must start to tell yourself and you're incentivized to have bad mental health almost so that you can overcome it for these stories. I don't know if that's...
Well, I think social media is taking care of the bad mental health part. And then...
That's true. You don't have to try that hard.
Yeah, exactly. There's plenty of things to be distraught about in 2025.
Have you ever found yourself at odds with an artist you're working with on like how the story is being told or how it's being communicated?
Sure. I think overall I've had overwhelmingly good experiences with the artists that I work with. I think generally artists understandably rarely have an understanding of what publicity is or how it functions or the processes involved of getting from point A to point B to point H and M and L. And, I wouldn't say artists are necessarily known for their patience. I think most of the frustrations tend to be of the nature of like, why isn't this happening faster? And why do you want to focus on this? And I'm like, well, these are the things that people will be interested in. And, there are artists who generally think that the only thing that should be spoken about is the music. And I'm like,
good luck.
You're right. Yes. You're 30 years too late on that storyline. So, I think any of those confrontations are literally just based on not understanding how PR works.
What do people get wrong most often?
I mean, most people don't seem to have an understanding of what PR is. Even people who have worked in the music industry for 20, 30 years seem to often have not a good understanding of what PR is and how it works, or they think it's social media. So we definitely get a lot of people applying for jobs who, there's a PR opening and they're like, oh, I've been doing social media marketing for the past. And I'm like, oh, well, yes, that's, I know that PR in the coming years will probably die and there'll only be social media marketing. But in the meantime, still have an understanding of what PR is.
Well, I was going to ask where you feel the wind is blowing. That's a pretty clear and bleak answer for your line of work, Brendan. Is that really your prediction?
I mean, I think so. I mean, the modern day, the majority of people don't spend much time reading these days. So social media is where storytelling is happening. And it's obviously in smaller snippets and in a visual format. But I think that's mostly... I think that there'll obviously be certain publications that manage to keep going and keep having interest in long format conversations. But I think that's number is going to continue to dwindle.
So from a guy who's not 21 anymore to another guy who's not 21 anymore, do you immerse yourself in the social media world to any degree? Do you feel obligated for your job to learn TikTok, or do you feel like that's better handled by more contemporary hands?
I mean, there are we certainly pitch social media platforms that are doing short form interviews with artists. And, I think more than anything, I think that social media departments and PR departments will merge in the coming years.
Yeah.
That's ultimately what's going to happen. You'll probably have some old fogey publicists like myself who's handling the TV bookings and NPRs and New York Times, while the younger folks are dealing with the latest star on TikTok who's doing interviews with artists coming through town, which is great.
Yeah, there's you never see musicians on Hot Ones.
Yeah, I mean, you can do a lot of, they'll do social media takeovers for Hot Ones.
What, you just eat chicken wings by yourself?
Exactly.
I'm just here at Duff's Wings on College Street in Toronto, enjoying some hot wings alone.
Just a lonely artist eating wings.
Please go to musicpremiers.com to hear my new single. Don't worry, they premiered it.
Something along those lines, yes.
I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but I have not hardly at all asked you about working with Tokyo Police Club, other than we talked about the very, very early days, our first interview that we did, at least in the same physical space. As I said in my amazing intro, which I banged off in one take with no problems and no edits, I'm available for hire. You worked with us over our entire career. You mentioned Nasty Little Man earlier. That was the one other publicity company we worked with.
Indeed.
And then we found our way back to Brendan Bourke and stayed with you from then through the literal bitter end, because you were there.
There was one other blip in the not working together. But over the course of 18 years, had a lot of good highs and lows, and that first Letterman taping, obviously being an extremely high one. I don't know if any band since has gotten a Letterman performance out of 16 minutes of music.
Featuring the band performing on the last 10 seconds of our 2-minute song. Maybe that's why they had us on. It was they could let an interview go a little over because our song was so short.
Remember doing the nylon photo shoot on the west side of Manhattan, not far from Rich Cohen's apartment.
Yes, I think those photos still really live around the web if you're using the Google image search.
Absolutely. It's been cut and pasted onto a piece of paper.
I was going to say, what was your approach to working with Tokyo, especially in the early days? I'm not sure if that's quite what I mean, but how did you see the band, and how did you see, what was the story? What was the story of Tokyo Police Club in 2007?
You guys were so young at the time, so it all, and obviously the music was high energy. It all felt very fresh and new and exciting, and that's just really leaned into that, and the music spoke for itself, and just it was short blasts of infectious songs. So it was literally just a matter with that first Tokyo EP of just getting the name out there and getting name recognition and getting people out to see you guys, and that worked that EP for almost close to 2 years.
Yeah.
Which is, again, for 16 minutes of music is insane to think about, but it was literally just introducing, because that takes time as well. Usually you put out the first album is about name recognition. The second album is about getting half the people on board. And then the next album is about getting all those people who missed the boat to then get onto the boat, even if you've made a weaker record.
That is is it like the first 3 records are kind of where you build the foundation? I mean, I guess you could start anywhere as a first record. And then you'd be like, oh, well, this band's fourth record was the first one. Like the National feels like they did that.
Sure.
Alligator, Boxer, High Violet did exactly the thing you're talking about. That's
exactly
3, 4, 5.
Yeah. I mean, there's always the band or the artist that gets that lucky break and has this insane amount of buzz by single number 2, although they're usually from the UK.
Yeah. Is it just my perception, or is it a better landscape over there for like indie rock, guitar rock bands still?
Yeah. Oh no, it's not your perception. It is absolutely true. There's more music media in the UK still for a much smaller market.
Yeah.
Like there's actual magazines.
Yeah.
And they love their guitars still.
They still love them. They got like 7 BBCs going. A couple of those must still play guitar music.
Indeed.
I got to get back to the UK, man.
It's got to reinvent yourself as a British, some scallywag who popped up in East London.
Just doing a really broad accent.
There you go. Perfect.
Lying. This is the new PR. Yeah, you'd be like, this guy just came out of like that movie where Seth Rogen came out of the pickle vat. We just unearthed this musician, this indie rock musician from 1906.
It's been time sealed in a vat of pickle juice.
I think we're onto something here. Brendan Bourke, I know you know that we end every episode of Major Label Debut with the most important question. We have to modify it slightly for our guests who were not literally in the studio making a Major Label debut. So I will ask, in the early days of Tag Team, which just sounds, I loved how you talked about that. I loved just imagining being in that office, starting something new, getting on the phone in that moment. What were you eating to fuel those early heady days?
Well, the scary thing is I eat the same thing for lunch every day that I did in the late 90s. Which is an unturkey sandwich.
An unturkey. You could get an unturkey sandwich in the late 90s.
Indeed, in New York City.
Only in New York.
I would say if I was known for anything in the late 90s, early 2000s, food-wise, there was a vegetarian jerky called Jerky with like a hillbilly-looking dude on the cover. I think it was Jerquee. Always had that around. And then I always had deliveries of Bob Texas jalapeno chips, which were legendary.
And it seems to me, we were talking about how a lot of things about both of our jobs, about the music industry and the music press and everything has maybe not changed for the better in the past 3 decades. Is it true, though, that vegetarian eating, especially out and about outside of New York and LA, has really improved drastically over that same time period?
I would imagine life on the road as a vegetarian or vegan musician has gotten 100 times easier than it certainly was 20 years ago. When your only option was going to the Subway.
Yep. Yeah, I'm getting a lettuce and tomato.
Or getting the extremely sad salad from McDonald's.
I think they discontinued that. It was too depressing to go on.
Exactly.
Well, this conversation and our 20 years of work together and counting was the opposite of depressing. It was the opposite of bleak. And let me take this opportunity to formally say thank you, not just for all of the great PR work you did for us. Thank you, not just for coming to every Farewell Tokyo Police Club show, for being like part of our family this whole time, not just a coworker and friend, but thank you most importantly for one of the most important beers and memorable beers I ever drank in my life, that warm Trunk Tecate.
If I didn't do anything else, you are most welcome for that beer. But no, it has always been a great pleasure working with you guys and talking with you now.
Brendan Bourke, Publicity master, music lover, and like ally on the side of good and light. We salute you. Thank you for this podcast.
Great being on the podcast.
My friend, my colleague, the wonderful Brendan Bourke. It's easy and fun to talk shit about the music business and the people who work in it, but truthfully, I must tell you that one of my favorite parts of my whole life doing music was getting to know all these people who have been part of like the indie rock infrastructure that I have loved so much and that has changed my life so much. I've known Brendan for like 20 years now, and every time we hang out, I still hear some new amazing story that leaves me marveling. Just like, how do I get to sit here in this bar with this man who's been in all these rooms that I spent my life dreaming of being in? It's such a wonderful privilege and pleasure for me, and hopefully you got a sense of that in our conversation. Yeah, when Tokyo Police Club shut her down, Brendan came out to more shows than I think just about anyone who's not married to one of us. He's worked with and he works with so many hugely cool and important bands but he still made me and Tokyo Police Club feel like we were a big deal. And that really meant a lot to me, and it meant a lot to the band, and maybe it meant a lot to Brendan as well, and that really warms my heart good. So I'm really glad to have found a new way to hang out with Mr. Brendan Bourke. And I sent him a text to say, what's he promoting right now so that I can signal boost it, give it the coveted major label debut bump. And he mentioned Bodega, who we actually went to see together last year and who are amazing. Big Special, Dead Tooth, Nancy Adram, Auto Heart, Weekend Friends, and also Taco Bell's Feed the Beat music program, which at least when I was part of it, they would just like give bands a lot of Taco Bell gift cards. And I gotta say, pretty good stuff, especially when you're on the road. So shout outs to Taco Bell as well. Free advertising on MLD just this once, because it's Brendan. But that's it for the show today. Major Label Debut is produced by John Paul Bullock and Josh Hook. Our music is by Greg Alsop. Since this is a publicity-themed episode, I would really be remiss if I didn't ask you to spread the word about our show if you know anybody who would like it, or anybody who likes tacos and wants to hear me talk about them. This is a taco-themed outro now. Sometimes it just goes that way. You know the drill. Like, subscribe, follow, drop us a line. We love to hear from people. I would love to be able to respond to people on this show more if that's of interest, because, I don't know, I got to talk about something. Thank you so much for listening. It was such a pleasure. Thanks again to Brendan Bourke for hanging out and for everything he's done for me, which would take a whole podcast to talk about in and of itself. Major Label Debut will be back with more tales from the intersection of art and commerce and tacos. Stay cool, everybody.